This video is brought to you by friend of the channel Squarespace. Stick around to learn more about them, as well as a special offer they're making available through my channel. Recently, Apple held a showcase to promote the new lineup of iPad. Spoiler alert, it's still an iPad, only now it's got better specs, so your Netflix will load even faster? That'll be $2,000, thank you very much. To reveal the new iPad Pro, Apple recorded a commercial. It depicts a bunch of really beautiful objects and creative tools. A piano, a guitar, a bust, a chessboard, notebooks, etc. These items were arranged on a gigantic hydraulic press. And when I saw this, I thought to myself, there's no way they're about to do what I think they're about to do. Sure enough, they did. They just crushed all of this really beautiful stuff. You just watched it all buckle and burst and pop, and when the press lifted back up, it revealed the new iPad. It was meant to be a metaphor for, look how many creative tools we've crammed into this thing. But to me it said something very different. To me it said, look how little we care about these beautiful objects and tools that are used to create art. They will be crushed, literally, under the weight of Apple's technology. To me, it also said something else. To me, it also said something about the collective sociopathy of the executives who greenlit this. This ad proposal would have been in the works for like 9 months plus. Hundreds of people would have seen it. Dozens of executives would have had to sign off on it. And not one single person with any decision-making power along the way stopped and said, you know what? This is kind of fucked. Let's not do this. For the past 18 months, it's felt like the video game industry has been in that same hydraulic press, operated by the same dead-eyed executives. After the high player counts and profits of the pandemic, where everyone was stuck inside with nothing to do but play video games, the shareholders continued to demand that the line go up, even as people were spending less time at home and cost of living pressures increased. The price of games had already gone up to $70, so you couldn't charge more. Consumers had drawn clear lines in the sand about how much monetization they wanted in their premium games, so there wasn't too much room to move there either. What then did the majority of studios and publishers turn to? Cost cutting. Since January of last year, over 20,000 games industry workers have lost their jobs. Very few major publishers or developers have been untouched by these changes. It's almost no exaggeration to say that every week a new round of layoffs is announced for some studio or publisher. I used to have a recurring segment in my show called No Fucking Thanks, where every week I covered the various NFT scams that publishers were trying to roll out. That segment went away because the bottom fell out of the NFT market, and so suddenly, mysteriously, publishers lost interest. Replacing that segment is a weekly recap of studio layoffs and closures. And frankly, I'd rather go back to the NFT days because at least we could laugh at those. There's nothing funny about what's going on in the industry right now. Announcements of studio closures and layoffs are so commonplace at this point that, dare I say, people are becoming numb to it. With so many studios closed and so many jobs lost, what's another 1 or 2 each week? It's normal at this point, right? No, first of all, this is not normal. Ask anyone who's been in this industry for any length of time and they will tell you that there's never been anything like this. The scale of cutbacks has no parallel. The closest one you might draw is the video game crash of 1983, but that was different because the industry was actually crashing. Revenues plummeted by almost 97% back then. Here, many of the companies affecting the biggest layoffs are recording record profits. So no, this is not normal, even though it's starting to feel that way after 18 months of new layoff and closure announcements every single week. But even with that preceding 18 months of carnage, this week has still felt very different. It started with the announcement that Take-Two Interactive, a company that made $2 billion in profit last year and that is about to release GTA 6, a game that will make an obscene amount of money over the next decade, that company shuttered 2 indie studios and laid off a huge portion of the staff behind its AA publishing arm, Private Division. Private Division is or was a great play for Take-Two. It was them making bets on good, honest video games. Single-player games, strategy titles, weird RTS hybrid shit, skateboarding games, killer roller derby games, no in-game spending in sight. Sure, this is the label that brought us the disappointing Disintegration and Ancestors, the Humankind Odyssey, but it was also the label that brought us The Outer Worlds, and Oli Oli World, and Rollerdrome, and most recently, No Rest for the Wicked. So to be clear, it does appear as though Private Division will continue to exist in some form, but it's also clear that Take-Two have scaled back their ambitions for what that label will be doing in the future. We know that because they sacked a huge portion of the people running that label, and more importantly, they closed 2 of the most important studios under that label. Intercept Games were the latest stewards of the Kerbal Space Program franchise. That was a studio set up by Private Division to develop the sequel, a sequel that ended up being a huge disappointment for a number of reasons. That game flopped, and there are more people playing Kerbal 1 than Kerbal 2, by a factor of 5 to 1, in fact. Now the fate of the sequel is unclear, as all the staff supporting it were let go last week. That brings us to Roll 7, the other studio that Take-Two Interactive shuttered last week. You may not have heard of Roll 7, but you've almost certainly heard of their two most recent releases. Oli Oli World was an absolutely brilliant, gorgeous art-directed and mechanically clever skateboarding game. It sits at 94% very positive on Steam, a strong 86 on OpenCritic, and it was on multiple Game of the Year lists when it released back in 2022. Less than a year later, this same studio released Rollerdrome. Rollerdrome was fucking incredible, like Tony Hawk mixed with Max Payne with the cell shading of Jet Set Radio and the understated lo-fi futurism and red sweatsuits of Bionic Man. This game absolutely ruled, one of the best games of the year, one of my games of the year, it was a BAFTA winner, and Roll 7 released this roughly 15 months after releasing another game of the same exceptional quality and award-winning pedigree. And Strauss Zelnick, the CEO of a corporation that makes $2 billion a year in profit and is about to make a lot more than that thanks to GTA, looked at this team and what they had just done and said, let's shut them down. And to be clear, even if you didn't want to keep them, you didn't have to shutter them. You could have put them out to tender, let someone else buy them. Maybe the workers could buy it as a collective. I don't know. There are options. But no, the studio was summarily shuttered, and all of that incredible talent and the creative energy that bound them together is now scattered to the winds. It really does feel like that hydraulic press, just indiscriminate, uncaring destruction of the things, in this case people, who are able to create art. Sadly, it's a story we're all too familiar with recently, but it's also one we've seen plenty of times in the past.
We acquired Lionhead in 2006, shut it down in 2016. A couple years later, we reflected back on that experience. What did we learn? How do we not repeat our same mistakes?
You acquire a studio for what they're great at now, and your job is to help them accelerate how they do what they do, not them accelerate what you do.
Earlier this week, Microsoft announced that it was shuttering 3 studios and merging another into ZeniMax Online. The merger was Roundhouse Games, a studio formed from previous Human Head Studios employees, the team that worked on the original Prey and the prototype for Prey 2, which never saw the light of day. Since then, the studio has provided support to a number of titles, including Arcane's Redfall, but most of their work has been in support of the Elder Scrolls Online, hence they're being merged into the main studio that manages that game. One of the 3 studio closures that Microsoft announced was Alpha Dog Games. They're a mobile developer founded back in 2012, and most recently they released Mighty Doom, a top-down mobile shooter that no one really asked for, and it seems it wasn't particularly successful. That game will soon be sunset, aka delisted from storefronts on August 7th this year. That brings us to Arcane Austin, the second studio that Microsoft announced it was closing. This is a bit of a complicated one. On the one hand, Arcane Austin have made some of the greatest video games ever. Dishonored 1, Prey Moon Crash, which I still believe is the smartest, best designed immersive sim in existence, by the way, but that's a whole other video. The legacy of that studio is beyond reproach, a legacy unspoiled by their most recent release, Redfall. I don't need to recount the tragedy of Redfall to you, but I do think it's worth recounting the fact that Arcane Austin did not want to make that video game. They were victim to the whims of Bethesda's management, which at one point pivoted most of their main studios towards live service garbage. That's how we got Fallout 76. That's how we got Wolfenstein Youngblood, and that is how we got Redfall. It was part of a broader trend that saw great single-player focused studios like Crystal Dynamics, BioWare, and Rocksteady fed to this live service meat grinder, the slop that emerges from the other side being utterly unsalvageable. And that's exactly what Redfall was, sadly. Right up until the buzzer, Arcane were working on a major patch for the game, and both Bethesda and Microsoft leadership had repeatedly reiterated that they planned to stick with Redfall. I'd always said that was a bad idea because Redfall could not be saved, and any time spent on it was time that could have been spent making an actual Arcane game, and wouldn't you know it, reporting that emerged after the news of the closure broke revealed that Arcane Austin were in the process of pitching a return to the immersive sim genre, most likely Dishonored 3. Now, that'll never happen, and as excited as I am for a Blade game from Arcane Leon, it would have been nice to also have Dishonored 3, or ideally Prey 2, but let's be real, that was never going to happen. After Redfall launched, there was reporting from a couple of sources, but mainly Bloomberg, that Arcane Austin had suffered significant talent drain over the course of Redfall's development, precisely because Arcane people don't want to make a live service looter shooter, which is what Redfall initially was before it was reworked. Bethesda's management put them on a project that they didn't want to work on, and they weren't equipped to deliver it well, so people left. It wasn't Microsoft that put them on this path, it was Bethesda and ZeniMax. Microsoft just tried to cash out as best they could by releasing Redfall in its sorry, underbaked state, Phil Spencer himself acknowledging that they expected middling reviews. Microsoft owns the end result, but how they got there is entirely on Bethesda. But Microsoft does own this decision to close Arcane Austin rather than rebuild it to deliver the sort of game that Arcane Austin wanted to make, and their decision to say no speaks volumes. The promise of Microsoft's massive cash splash in studio acquisitions before Activision Blizzard King was the idea of letting studios just do their thing. Let them make the games that they want to make, and Microsoft will underwrite them because they want a big, diverse portfolio of interesting content to put on Game Pass. They wanted to back the risky bets, they wanted to encourage creativity, they wanted to use the Game Pass model as a cushion or a safety net that allowed individual studios to make games that they wouldn't otherwise get to make. Does anyone really think that Microsoft is still committed to that goal at this point in 2024? If you do, perhaps you haven't heard that Microsoft also shuttered Tango Gameworks, makers of The Evil Within 1 and 2, Ghostwire Tokyo, and the multi-award winning Hi-Fi Rush. And this was the one that really knocked people over, in the same way that Roll 7 knocked me over last week. With Arcane, you were like, oh, that really sucks. But, you know, Redfall was bad and there were rumors of talent drain. If you were to be generous to Microsoft's C-suite, you might be like, alright, I kind of see it. But in Hi-Fi Rush, Tango Works literally released one of the only good first-party exclusive games that Microsoft has delivered in 2 console generations. Before that, Ghostwire Tokyo wasn't great, but it had a lot of promise that a sequel could explore. The Evil Within 2 is held up as one of the best survival horror games in years. You're going to look at that studio with that track record, who just delivered a Game of the Year contender, and say, there's no profit to be made here, let's shut it down. The reactions to the news of all of these closures has been widespread anger, disappointment, and condemnation of Xbox and their leadership. Dinga Bakaba, creative director at Arcane Lyon, gave the most poignant response when he said, quote, "Don't throw us into gold fever gambits. Don't use us as straw men for miscalculations, blind spots. Don't make our work environments Darwinist jungles. You say we make you proud when we make a good game? Make us proud when times are tough. We know you can. We've seen it before," end quote. Before also adding, quote, "It's a fucking gut stab," end quote. John Johannes, game director for Hi-Fi Rush, had this to say, quote, "So this is how it ends. Unfortunately, I don't quite have the words, but at least thank you to everyone who supported us," end quote. Tango Gameworks studio founder Shinji Mikami let his brevity speak for him, quote, "Tango closed, sad," end quote. Michael Dowse is head of Larian Publishing, and he said this, quote, "I cannot imagine that hearing you're being let go because of prioritization of another developer is especially good for morale, especially if you're in another regional office of a shuttered sister office. Imagine reading that and you're working in Obsidian or something wild," end quote. And speaking of Obsidian, their comms director, Mikey Dowling, said this, quote, "Why do I still do this?" end quote. It's a question that a lot of game developers are asking right now, because if you get fired when you make a bad game that flops, but you also get fired when you make a good game that's successful, then why the fuck would you build a career in an industry that works that way? And Hi-Fi Rush was successful, unless Microsoft's Aaron Greenberg was lying when he said this last year, quote, "Hi-Fi Rush was a breakout hit for us and our players in all key measurements and expectations. We couldn't be happier with what the team at Tango Gameworks delivered with this surprise release," end quote. I saw a tweet from one person that was talking about relocating for a games job, which is really common in the industry, by the way. Many studios will ask developers to relocate if they wanted to work for them, particularly the bigger studios. And this tweet was like, why would anyone do that now? Like, if you had a family or whatever, why would you upend your entire life and go work for a company that may or may not make you redundant, regardless of how good or successful the thing you work on is? This is sure to have a chilling effect on Microsoft's overall talent pipeline going forward, because if developers cannot trust you to make rational decisions about their employment, then why the fuck would they ever want to make themselves subject to your whims? That means less talented people working at Microsoft-owned studios, which means shittier games for everyone. And just as game workers are waking up and realizing that you can't trust Microsoft, game players are realizing the exact same thing, as these and other recent moves have totally upended the way we view Xbox, its strategy, and their likely role as a platform holder in the future. I mean, take Japan, for example. For years, Phil Spencer has been trying to get a foothold in the Japanese market, both with their consumers and their studios and publishers. He's been making regular trips to Japan, he's been meeting with key people, securing deals to get games like Final Fantasy XIV onto Xbox. He was hustling, man, like properly hustling to make Xbox big in Japan, and Tango Gameworks was that Japanese-based successful developer that gave them a foothold into the Japanese talent pool. Why the fuck would you shut them down? The Verge obtained an internal memo from head of Xbox Publishing, Matt Booty, and it painted an even grimmer picture of what these closures mean for Microsoft's future strategy. Quote, These changes are grounded in prioritizing high-impact titles and further investing in Bethesda's portfolio of blockbuster games, end quote. It also said that Xbox is doubling down on Bethesda franchises that are, quote, best positioned for success, end quote. You think we're going to get another Pentiment or Grounded style game from Obsidian now? Do you feel confident that Xbox will continue to fund Psychonauts developer Double Fine? You think that Ninja Theory are feeling confident about their prospects after Hellblade 2 ships, especially given that Microsoft seems to have spent $0 and 0 cents marketing that video game? Want a little more proof that this strategy of supporting the smaller, riskier bets is on the way out? Bloomberg reports that Matt Booty addressed Bethesda staff after news of the closures was announced. There he said the company's studios had been spread too thin, quote, like peanut butter on bread, end quote. This man can't even quote Lord of the Rings without getting it wrong. Jill Braff was also there. She's the head of ZeniMax Studios, and she attributed the closure to just, being too busy. Quote, it's hard to support 9 studios all across the world with a lean central team with an ever-growing plate of things to do. I think we were about to topple over, end quote. Then why the fuck would you acquire all of these studios if you couldn't manage them? But look, I get it. It's a lot of work to manage people who make games. So I have a suggestion for any executive struggling with their workload. It's called crunch. See, all you have to do is work day in, day out for like 6 to 36 months. And at the end of that, you get laid off. You forced your people to work that way for decades and they didn't complain, to your face at least. So why don't you give it a try? See how it goes. Let us know. All of this became utterly farcical when in the same meeting, Matt Booty said, quote, we need smaller games that give us prestige and awards, end quote. He really said that after just closing Tango Gameworks, the studio that gave them Hi-Fi Rush. And I think it really shows how broken the executive brain is because, fuck prestige, fuck awards. You need smaller games because it's good for the lifeblood of the industry. You need smaller games because they serve as the petri dish for ideas and innovation. You need smaller games because it lets younger developers cut their teeth on lower risk projects. You need smaller games because if every available resource is channeled into massive AAA live service MAU fattening slop, this industry will Ouroboros itself to death. Bro, you need smaller games for sales. Manor Lords sold over 1 million units in one day, and that is a game made by largely one person. Same for Balatro. Hell, Palworld has been your biggest third-party Game Pass title ever, and it was made by a team of less than 50 people. Executives really do think that these small games are only just for show, when they can be so much more than that on every vector. But this is unfortunately the crux of the matter. Xbox ran a good third place race for 2 console generations, and I really do believe that Phil Spencer tried his absolute hardest to get Microsoft back into pole position. I believe that. History will not be kind to Phil Spencer's track record as a leader, but I don't think anyone can doubt the earnestness with which he pursued the goal of an Xbox that was defined by great games. The problem is that, generally speaking, Phil and his team never knew how to make great games, only acquire the studios that did. The biggest failure of Microsoft this past 2 console generations has been their inability to nurture a stable of development talent that could carry their franchises into the post-Xbox 360 era, a failure typified by 343 throwing 3 airballs in a row on Xbox's flagship franchise, Halo. Hell, 4 in a row if you count that god-awful TV show, because my god, that was bad. The acquisition of smaller studios helped obscure the reality that Microsoft couldn't incubate them themselves. The acquisition of Bethesda did the same thing. At the same time, Game Pass was steadily growing, and so maybe Xbox didn't need to grow development talent. Maybe they could just acquire stuff and put it on Game Pass. Well, the music stopped in 2022 when Game Pass subscriptions plateaued, audiences were allowed out of their house again, and Xbox console sales were not doing what they were supposed to be doing, as Xbox still had not delivered the sort of games that would put wind in their sails. At that point, Microsoft was fat with cash, and Activision Blizzard King was wobbling under the weight of toxic workplace allegations that saw the Blizzard president Jay Allen Brack fired, and Bobby Kotick faced absolutely no consequences whatsoever, but that's another story. Still, he had an appetite to sell, and Phil Spencer was in a buying mood. A grueling legal battle, and $69 billion later, Phil Spencer was now the proud owner of the world's largest video game publisher, their revenue propped up primarily by 2 things, Call of Duty and Candy Crush. That transaction was completed last year, and this past financial quarter, Microsoft reported its first post-acquisition results. Xbox games and services revenue was up an impressive 61%. Pretty good, right? The only catch, 60% of that came from Activision Blizzard King. There really couldn't be a more perfect demonstration of Xbox's anemic organic growth set against the gains it achieves through acquisitions. But imagine that. Imagine if all of a sudden you got a 60% pay increase. you'd start thinking a little differently, wouldn't you? Well, it's the same for companies, only they're not quite like you and I. We'd look at that 60% increase and we'd think, damn man, I'm set for life, or at least the next couple of years. Companies, on the other hand, think, okay, I grew 60% last year, how do I maintain double-digit growth every single year forever? At that point, how can you expect Microsoft to really care about Hellblade 2 or Hi-Fi Rush 2 or even a Dishonored pitch? We think our world of core gaming is like big, but it's actually just a tiny drop in the ocean compared to the live service behemoths like Call of Duty and Fortnite, and it's like a few speckles of mist compared to the mobile market. So when Jill Braff complains about not having enough time in her day to keep all those plates spinning, what she's really saying is, that plate is too small to care about now. When Matt Booty says these changes are grounded in prioritizing high-impact titles, what he's really saying is, we're going to make Fallout, Elder Scrolls, and Doom. Everything else can take a walk. And Matt Booty says, we need smaller titles to win awards and prestige. That's what he thinks they're for at this point. They're little trophies to be collected and displayed. They are not core to Microsoft's business as a profit-seeking entity. Many have called for the end of Phil Spencer's leadership, but I'm going to let you in a little secret. It doesn't matter who leads Xbox at this point. You think someone's going to come in and all of a sudden greenlight Prey 2, StarCraft 3, a Conker's Bad Fur Day reboot? Nah, man, that is not how this works now. The Xbox acquisition budget payback imperative is bigger than any leader who might assume responsibility for it. It will guide their decision-making far more than Reddit threads or viral tweets or fucking YouTubers. If I sound down on Xbox, it's because I am. And not just because of this recent round of closures, mind you. It's a more generalized sadness that Xbox really did try to do some stuff this past 2 generations, and I really believe that. But between the stagnant Game Pass growth, the lack of games, the declining console sales, the layoffs and closures, and the recent move to a multi-platform third-party publishing model, it just feels like the grand experiment has failed, and we enter now a new chapter where Microsoft refashions themselves in a new, more profitable, but less appealing image. We had hoped that Microsoft would transform Activision, but recent decisions seem to indicate that Activision is transforming Microsoft. I mean, we're getting a deep dive look at the next Call of Duty at the end of the next Microsoft showcase in June. And if that isn't proof positive of the way this whole thing is going, then I don't know what is. There are still going to be plenty of things to be excited about within the Xbox publishing library, for sure. I think what's happening right now will continue to happen over the coming years, but it'll happen in fits and starts. I look forward to those exciting reveals and releases, but am I optimistic about the overall trajectory and the future of Xbox and where it'll be in 10 years' time? I don't know, man. I don't know how anyone could be after this week. Typically, when console platforms have been on the ropes, they've had to claw themselves back with great games and great hardware. I don't think Microsoft wants to play that game anymore. Microsoft are now in a position where they'll make more money from a Candy Crush Battle Pass than they will from a AAA arcane game, which would be fine if Microsoft were also willing to support the AAA arcane game or the Hi-Fi Rush sequel, but they aren't. And that's what this round of closures proves, and that is why they really fucking suck. Anyway, that is all I got. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next week with the regular news. Until then, take care of yourselves. See you next time. Bye-bye. Are you an artist, photographer, or someone who works in the visual mediums? If so, I'm jealous of you. I wish I had skills like that. Imagine being able to draw something and it not look terrible. That would be cool. Anyway, if you fall into that category and you are looking to promote your work, then you might want to think about publishing a portfolio somewhere, and there's no better tool to help you do that than Squarespace. Squarespace have ready-made portfolio templates that you can select and immediately begin customizing to your personal taste. When you're happy with the design, you can begin uploading your work, and it's going to look super professional because that's Squarespace's speciality, professional-looking websites. It's not just about looks though. Squarespace can help you promote your work through email campaigns, through SEO tools, and through social media integration, so your work can be discovered and shared. You don't need any knowledge or experience to get started with this stuff. Squarespace have put in all the work to make the entire process so easy and so seamless, even for absolute beginners. As I mentioned earlier, Squarespace are a long-running partner of this channel, 3 years running now actually. I really appreciate that support. Squarespace are helping me turn my passion into a career, and that's what they do for a lot of people, because if you want to turn your passion into a career, then a website is a really good place to start. To get started, visit squarespace.com, and if you really want to get serious, visit squarespace.com/skillup to get 10% off your purchase of a website or a domain name. Thanks Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.